So the first thing I wanted to talk about is why solutions journalism, right? And it's part of what I shared with you in the first lecture. And it's really about making the case. Look, I can talk to you till the cows come home about how solutions journalism is truly journalism, right? We want to focus on the responses to the problems and not just shed light to the problems. I think it's really important to shed light to the problems. That's part of the responsibility of a journalist, but we fall short in doing our jobs when we stop at just shedding light. And that's why I gravitated to solutions journalism to provide um, greater emphasis on the responses to the problems because we can measure the responses, right? We can measure how successful a response is or how ineffective a response is. And there's a lot of learnings to that. Also, it's about building trust and it's about understanding what is driving so many people away from news coverage. And that's because, as this slide tells you, many of them think it's just too negative. And part of it being too so negative, it's that focus, overwhelming focus on the problem and not enough about what the responses are to solving those problems. So the first proposition for solutions journalism is understanding and listening to what the communities that we serve need from us. And it's not about watering down the news or putting lipstick on a pig in regards to news. It's just really about providing a full picture of a situation and not just leaning in on one aspect of it. And then let's see if I do the magic of. All right, great. So the second one continues to re-emphasize what data tells us in regards to audiences and what they're looking for from their news outlets, local, national news outlets. And again, this, I don't need to read all of them, but it's an emphasis, 83% on solutions stories versus just 55% on problem stories. Helping utilizing what you're reporting to not only inform the public, but to educate them and empower them, right? We, especially when we're talking about climate coverage, when there's, of course, lots of information in regards to the changes that our planet is experiencing. And then, of course, the local stories about how these communities are being impacted. It it is our responsibility to provide information or stories that are more than just informative, that are more than just educating someone, but really as a tool to help them do something about it, whether it's asking better from their elected officials, whether it's organizations utilizing that information as they're lobbying both the community as the middle persons, lobbying the community and lobbying those in power to affect change. So again, I'm a big believer in data. I think data drives a lot of the journalism that I produce personally and in our newsrooms. And I think it's important to show data in regards to why solutions journalism. It's not just my opinion or just my style of writing. It's just really numbers never lie and the proof is in the pudding. Please keep your mics muted. Okay, so you've seen this, you've heard me say solutions journalism is rigorous evidence-based reporting on the responses to social problems, right? That's the common thread through this whole 2 weeks. And then a solutions journalism story needs to have these four pillars. And why these four pillars? Because it's in the responses, as I've already said, is what we can identify and measure success or the lack thereof, and really in telling the stories. We need the evidence, right? We need to be very transparent with our viewers, listeners, our readers in regards to these responses in order for us not to be criticized as being a megaphone for public relations. And then what are the insights, right? What can we learn from the responses? And again, it's not just about producing here's how they're solving an issue, because a lot of times, going to the limitations, there's a lot to learn from what's not working. And all of this also to step away figuratively and physically from our desks, right, from our computers, because a lot of times the problems that a community is facing are similar and dissimilar to other social problems that are being dealt with, whether it's in the United States, across the state, or across the country, or across the globe. And I think there's too often there's this sort of myopic view of a problem that creates this sense of we're the only ones that are dealing with it, when we do figuratively and physically step away and look up, we can see that we're not the only ones dealing with this, especially when we're talking about climate coverage. There's a lot that you don't have to reinvent the wheel. And I think as a journalist, that affords us the opportunity when we are questioning those in power, whether they're elected officials or companies and organizations that are indirectly and directly affecting climate change. If there's a proposal that an elected official is looking to launch, right? There's the proverbial news conference because the president, the mayor, the governor, the mayor is announcing this new initiative. By understanding that how other responses elsewhere and the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of them, that really can help us inform our questioning. Why are you proposing this particular response if it hasn't worked in other places? Or maybe it has worked. How do you think it's going to work here if it's a different situation, be it geographical or budget or what have you? So by not just looking to produce solutions journalism stories, but really changing the culture of our newsrooms to incorporate these four pillars, it really helps shape not only the stories that we're producing, but how we conduct interviews, perhaps the stories that we pitch, and how we research stories. These four pillars have been very instrumental in our newsroom in fostering conversations that discuss and debate certain stories and whether or not we can apply solutions journalism to them. All right. So we talked a lot about what solutions journalism is, but what about what it isn't? And these are just examples. And again, I've given this to you. It's not hero worship. We're not here to just say, oh, look at what a wonderful job this particular individual is doing, or this particular organization or community. It's really by stepping away and not just highlighting the individuals. It's really about unfolding the responses and utilizing those four pillars and letting the story tell itself. And by doing that, we eliminate the criticism of just being, again, a megaphone for public relations, or just hero worshiping an individual or an organization. It's not about a silver bullet, right? There's no turnkey solution to any particular problem, but by leaning in on evidence and insights and limitations, we really start to differentiate nuances in those responses. I live in Chicago, Illinois, where from a environmental perspective, there's a lot of problems that have to do with lead pipes. In the United States, Chicago, among all of the urban areas, has had a very difficult time in converting lead pipes that have shown scientifically to have adverse effects, especially with young children and people with compromised immune systems.
Looking fine, but I don't know what
please mute your mics. So by not only just looking at the responses in Chicago, but looking elsewhere, we produced a story about a similar response in Newark, New Jersey. We were able to identify that even though there are similar issues and similar responses, because of a number of different issues, beginning with budget, population size, and other, what works in one community might not necessarily work in the other. And so, again, we're not producing stories that are sort of cut and paste, even though the problems are similar from one area to the next. And then, again, as I've mentioned this previously, we're not public relations, right? We're not marketing this very new gadget or new response to solving issues. It's really about investigating those responses. And so a lot of times what I've seen and experienced in mainstream media here in the United States is there's a lot of stories about great ideas that are literally cut and paste from press releases that are coming from elected officials or other organizations that are designed really to promote their brand or expand their brand and their perspectives. It is our job to really look at those press releases and start to dissect it. Surely there's a lot of good information, but there's also information in between that, what they're sending, that's really important to surface. Here are three examples, and this really comes from one of our guests that was mentioned in the lecture, and that's really looking at three different areas when it comes to climate solutions journalism. And this speaks to being very sensitive and sensible in covering these stories, because we're often talking about communities that are the most vulnerable. So it's, as you're thinking about climate solutions journalism stories, I think these are three very important areas to think about in your storytelling. Please mute your mics. Mitigation is really important because a lot of times what we've seen in regards to climate change, it is communities having to pivot in regards to what they're experiencing. And so by emphasizing mitigation as you're researching and doing your climate solution stories, that really provides a lot of emphasis and important data that is useful in the audience understanding what the problem is, as well as what the response is to those problems. Adaptation, I think it's also a very good area to lean in on in your stories, because in the responses to these problems, a lot of times what we've seen is a lot of important innovations that happen from mitigation strategies. And so we, especially in the agricultural industry, when that a lot of times those farmers are dealing with seasons not being as they were 20, 50 years ago, a lot of innovation is happening through adaptation. I've seen a lot of important work, especially in the Middle East, when it comes to rising temperatures and how adaptation is changing the lifestyle of people that are increasingly facing with increasing temperatures and minimizing some of the resources that are no longer there, that were there 15, 20 years ago. And then lastly, I think it's resilience, and really understanding, appreciating, and respecting how people, and again, in the example in this slide, many indigenous people, at least in this country, have had to change in order to adapt. So telling stories from those three perspectives around climate solution stories humanizes the issue. Too often, I see a lot of stories that talk about the people that are being affected by climate change, and not enough from the people that are being affected. So I think by emphasizing in resilience, you get the opportunity to raise the visibility and the voices of the people that are often talked about but not spoken to. Again, these are three different areas in that I've seen that are very effective in climate solutions reporting that might be useful to you as you're looking to produce your own stories. And then lastly, I think this should be the goal for everybody. I think the for the almost 1,000 people that have signed up for this class, one of your goals should be, and this is something that we talk about in our newsroom in regards to changing our culture, right? We want to go from a culture, a prevalent culture, at least in the United States, that's problem focused to one that's solutions based because of the reasons that I shared with you in regards to providing content that is not just informative, but also educational and empowering. And we want to frame it, have deficit frames to strength-based narratives, again, from a perspective of or a narrative or a framing that often people feel overwhelmed with to one where they feel there's an opportunity to do something about it and not feel so helpless as they often do when we stop short of telling stories that are too too focused on the problem and not enough on the responses to those problems. And then I think it's leveraging solutions journalism to nurture relationships with communities that are often feel disconnected from media that inherently is supposed to be an extension of themselves and a tool for them to help make better decisions. Especially in the United States, a lot of it driven by political ideology. There's the gap in regards to the community looking to media as a trusted source is continuously widening. And so solutions journalism helps build a bridge and over time build a relationship with the people, the communities that we serve, because we're being transparent in regards to how we, from soup to nuts, are producing stories, especially stories that have such a large impact on our lives, like climate change. And then lastly, I've mentioned this in our mid a week email. If I don't know, I'm not sure it hasn't gone out yet, but I will be sharing this in both midweek and end of week conversations. And this is work done by the monitor, the science monitor. Why I'm sharing it is because a lot of times when we're thinking about stories, and in particularly climate stories, but I would apply that to almost every category. We're not thinking about we're thinking very much in this wide net umbrella broad stroke approach when storytelling is most effective when you narrow it down. And I think what the Science Monitor is doing with their series is focusing on youth. Really, the population, the community that is inheriting a lot of the problems that were made by generations before them, and engaging with them is going to be really important, and also capturing their perspectives on what they're experiencing is really important. In general, young people are absent and ignored in media, especially in the United States. I just today had a conversation with an organization that's focused on providing civic engagement with young people in affording them a platform to tell stories from their perspectives in regards to the Democratic National Convention that's happening here in Chicago. And that's so important because how young people consume news and information and entertainment is very different than people like me who are 54 years old, where I didn't grow up with social media, let alone the internet, the digital platform, as sophisticated as it is now, it matured when I was already, I think, my late 20s, early 30s. So a lot of what young people have grown up with in a very organic way, I've had to learn, and I still am learning. So when we talk about climate change and we talk about reporting and we talk about reaching different audiences, larger audiences, there's a lot to learn from by engaging young people, and not only from an editorial standpoint and how they look at climate change, but also in learning how to package content in a way that is reaching them because of where they're going to and how they consume that news and information, whether it's social media like TikTok or Instagram and the nuances between them, as well as being seen and heard when it comes to um, climate coverage. And that is my short, long deck. Let me stop sharing so I could see you again. Um, so now, I wanted to use this time really to hear from you, speak to you, answer any questions that you might have. Um, Thus far, 3 days into our 2-week course, you can unmute yourself or raise your hand, and I'll go to you, or you could send me a question on the chat. In a room full of journalists, we can't have any shy people.
I've got one for you. I'm just typing it in the
Okay.
chat.
Okay. Mohammed.
Thanks a lot for this. Thanks a lot for this insightful course, and I really want to talk about what's happening here in the Middle East. Sometimes journalists are told that you are always negative and you are giving too much dark news, if we can say. The Equal for Solution journalism in MENA region is talking about positive things that done by the governments. So what do you think of this? What we should do and how we can solve this issue? Thanks.
I'm sorry, can you repeat? I only got the last part. Government. Can you repeat the question?
Okay. Here in the Middle East, when they are always accusing journalists that we are doing a lot of negative news and dark things, as you mentioned before. So when they talk about solution journalism, they talk about telling positive things about governments. How we can work on this issue? Thanks.
Yep, and thank you for your question. Look, historically, journalists have had an adversarial relationship with governments because we check those in power, right? In the United States, it's embedded into our Constitution. It is my responsibility, my constitutional duty in the United States to hold the powerful accountable and give voice to the voiceless, right? So I think that that's always going to happen, right? There's no magic wand where that's going to go away. I think and using an example in the United States where too often journalists are accused of fake news, the proof is in the pudding. If you have the data that supports the emphasis of your story, they can argue all they want about it being negative or an attack of an individual, a government, or an organization. But good reporting that is transparent in regards to where the data is collected, they might not like what you write or produce on whatever platform, radio, television, etc., but they can't argue the facts. And even in the United States, like I've mentioned, and I'm sure you're all aware, where it's been politicized alternative facts. There's no alternative facts. The facts are the facts. And you can't, and yes, people will try to manipulate them, but I think the more transparent that you are, you're not gonna, you're never gonna develop a friendship or you wouldn't even want that, but any productive relationship with government, especially when they feel defensive. But I think if you continuously produce content and demonstrate that the facts are what they are, whether it ends up being positive or negative to them, I think there it'll be very difficult for them to chip away at your integrity and credibility. And that's what's most important when it comes to serving the public. Thank you for your question. So I'm looking at other ones. Let's see. Any questions? On the first, second by Beck, there was a comment about systemic examples. Focus ones. Can you give us an example of systemic examples? So this is a question from Dominica, who asked on the first or second slide early in the deck, there was a comment about systemic examples instead of individual focused ones. Can you give us an example of a systemic example? So systemic examples are ones that are perpetual, right? So you want to demonstrate, and this is data that you collect, that the response to a particular problem is working and not working specifically in a particular situation, but how is it working in similar situations that are outside of your scope? So so in order to do that, you need to have you need to investigate how where this particular response is being used, and then demonstrate the data that showcases the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of that particular response. So any response that is working will perpetually demonstrate that same effectiveness, whether it's here in the city of Chicago, or if I compare it to comparable cities like New York, Los Angeles, Houston. So examples of systemic responses are those that are not one-shots, that are not an aberration, so to speak, of a particular response, but ones that have demonstrated over and over again their effectiveness, or like I said, lack thereof. Because if it's not working, and it hasn't worked before, then what is the thinking behind that this time it's actually going to work? So by collecting that data, and much more than just what's in front of you, you as a journalist have the opportunity to either demonstrate why this response is being enacted, adopted, and used because it's worked elsewhere, or you can question it, as I've mentioned, why enacted this here when it's proven to have not worked elsewhere.
Thanks. That's a great answer. I have a really quick follow-up on that.
Yeah.
I'm interested in finding out, our local our local hydro here did a program where they gave out free heaters or free coolants for the climate change. So everybody got a free fan, and a lot of the people had problems installing them. So I think the program was a bit of a failure. So if I talked about that, would that wouldn't be an example of a systemic, because that would just be a one situation, one city, one province, one issue. So how would you make that into a systemic argument? Would you look at how other provinces
exactly
have done?
So the first question to ask is that they rolled out these free coolants, right?
Yeah.
Where else?
Basically fans, electric fans for seniors and low income people. But the problem was they were difficult to install, and so a lot of them didn't get installed.
So the first question is, where else has this initiative been rolled out? And then ask the same question. We're having a problem with installing them here, that you have the same problem. And
Yeah.
I think if I'd be very surprised if this response this is the first time that this response has been enacted. I think if you can research where it's also been rolled out, I'd say 2 to 3 other places, and then
Right.
ask the question, we've had this problem here. Did you have the similar question, similar problem? If the answer is yes, then there you have now, like, why did you roll this out? Did you not know that in these other 3 places they had the same problem? Why did you make that decision? Or you, in your piece, you could demonstrate they rolled this out with this intention of helping seniors, but they, but in other communities where this is rolled out, this was a similar problem. So I think it helps shape what the story will be based on whether or not they had similar problems elsewhere.
Yeah, thank you. That's very informative. Thank you.
You're welcome. Next question. I have a question, unless somebody else, I can't really see everybody. All right, I have a question here from Sutirtha. Sorry if I mispronounced your name. I have been using the concepts you underlined to cover gender-based violence and researching modern slavery issues for a long time. But in developing economies like India, the impact of climate change is still being ignored by the emerging middle class. How stories of resilience can help change this perception? So, I think if I understand your question, it's about changing, or if you have you said the middle class ignoring, emerging middle class ignoring stories of developing economies research. I think, look, I think, quick answer is do more stories, right? But I do think if you put a face to a story, if you humanize the story, it has a very emotional and psychological impact to who's absorbing that information. A lot of times especially with climate coverage, it's a lot of statistics, and statistics are important, but it almost sterilizes the story itself. It's only when you put a face to the problem that people begin to listen to what the issues are, because the person that you, as the storyteller, are highlighting is either a reflection of who they are, or there's someone that they know. So if there's a disconnect between one community and the other in regards to how climate change is impacting them, then put a face to it. And it's not it's think about how effective storytelling. It might be apples and oranges, but a very popular way to storytell in the medium of the film industry is by narrowing down the principles of that story, right? Whenever we go to the movies, there's the main actor or actors and the supporting roles, but we're being asked to invest 2 hours in the story of an individual or a small group. And then for those 2 hours, we're experiencing what they're experiencing because we're investing in their story. Similarly, that's how we should selectively do stories. If we do stories that are too broad, then I, as the reader, the listener, the viewer, can't connect with that person because there's just too many people to invest time in. If it's a story that's just about numbers, numbers don't put a face and a voice to a person. But if you just focus on one person that's representative of a larger group or just a community, then now you're leveraging storytelling that is palpable because I see myself in that person, or I know that person. So I think when there's that disconnect, there's a disconnect because a certain community can't connect to a story or to the experiences of another person because you haven't introduced them to it. So I would suggest take that approach. Next question. Anybody want to voice their questions? I'm happy to read and destroy your pronunciation of your name, but you're welcome. So I have, let's see, Jan Lee is asking, Mr. El Howry's question prompts another question. In countries where journalistic freedoms may not, sorry, I just lost the question. In countries where journalistic freedoms may not be as free as here and journalists can be victimized, do you have any suggestions? I know I'm fortunate to be a journalist in the United States. There are a lot of journalists outside of the United States, and I'm not saying that there isn't risks that journalists have in the United States, but it's been my experience, nothing to compare with some of the experiences and that other journalists have in other parts of the planet. So I absolutely commend those journalists, and they're certainly a source of inspiration for me. I think it's easy for me to comment, right? Because I've never experienced that. So I very much recognize that I'm an outsider looking in. I can never truly answer that question because I ultimately think it's a personal answer. Each of us, as journalists, have to make a decision and really have a sort of line in the sand that we are unwilling to cross, especially putting ourselves in situations that could be detrimental to our well-being, including our lives. I think with that said, based on my experience, which is limited and certainly biased in the sense that with exceptions of Latin America, it's mostly been in the United States. I think the important thing is to engage in conversations that supersede the prime directive of the story. We don't spend enough time engaging with government organizations and individuals that we cover outside of when we do a story. I think we, as not just journalists, but communicators, need to do a better job of engaging with people when we're not covering them so that we better understand who they are and the work that they do, not just the title, right? And what we know the title does, and vice versa. I think when we engage people in a situation that is less pressured than when we're doing a story, when we do the story, when we do engage them in those situations, it's a different dynamic because you have not developed a personal relationship, but you're fostering a professional relationship where you understand what they have on their plate and vice versa. That's certainly helped me in situations that are high pressure because they know me outside of when I'm asking them a question for a story. They don't know me personally. I don't, have dinner with them or whatever, but they know me professionally and in a situation where I'm talking about my values as a journalist, what I think matters most and how I'm showing up every single day. I'm not showing up every single day to, to produce gotcha kind of stories. No, I'm showing up every single day with my personal values and integrating the values of the mission of our newsroom. Spend a little more time doing that, and I think it hopefully would will they diffuse situations when you're covering stories that question their authority. All right. Nobody else wants to unmute themselves? I'm going to continue reading questions. This is from Wasantha Ramanyake. I'm sorry. From Sri Lanka. Officially, the country declared bankrupt in 2022. Of course, extreme weather events are more frequent and media has other priorities. Climate change and its severe impacts on vulnerable communities are only focused for a short period. What strategies would you suggest to keep your editors focused? This is a great question on the impacts in adoption stories. So, oh my God, right? One of the biggest criticisms that I have on mainstream media is that we have a short attention span. It's like we're chasing, like what's the flavor of not even the month, the flavor of the day, and we we give it a lot of attention for if it's a big story, maybe a week, less than that, and then it goes away. Or stories, for example, like here in Chicago, not having to do with the environment, but gun violence, where every day there's a shooting and every day news media covers the shooting, where but it never follows through, not even from a solutions journalism story, just like a just true journalism story. So what happens is over time, gun violence locally is seen as a problem that only happens to geographically to a certain part of the city. And because of the people who live in that part of the city, in this case, the South and West Side, it only happens to a particular group. In this case, Black and brown communities. But the same thing applies to climate change. I think what you can do is propose to the editors, right? And this is all about conversations in situations that are not high pressure. I know every single morning I'm walking into the editorial meeting and the clock's ticking, right? Whether it's you work for a newspaper or television or radio, maybe it's a little bit different when you work for digital, but the clock's ticking and there's a high pressure to cover those stories and produce them within deadline. So you have to have these conversations in situations that are not high pressured and really lay the case. Talk about a particular situation and explain that this is something that is not, let's do it once and then we don't revisit it until something else happens. This is a constant. This happens perpetually. One of the things that I talk to my editors about are the social determinants of health. In the United States, that means education, health, the economy, community, environment. These aren't subjects that come and go. These are realities that intersect with government and organizations, for profit and not profit, that lobby government representing the community because of the impact that it has on people's lives. So when you speak to your editor and you're talking about climate, present it in a way that this isn't a one-off. This is what people are experiencing every single day, and look at how it's shaping, right? Because you have to branch it out, how it's shaping their lives. So what you're presenting is it could be a beat where you're regularly producing stories on this particular topic, or it's a series that really unpacks what the issues are and then looks to revisit them, maybe not as frequently as a beat that could be weekly or monthly, but with some consistency. Maybe it's in every 3 months. I think in quarters, so I'm always thinking 3 months is more or less a good litmus test of consistent work. But again, in the United States and how I talk to editors, I lean in on the social determinants of health because even if I just focus on health, health branches out to pharmaceuticals. Health branches out to specific um, uh, illnesses that affect particular demographics, government, and the private sector in regards to health insurance. So there's a lot to tell just within focusing on health. The same thing with environment. I think if you take that approach and you lay it out and then use some metrics and telling the editor over time by by emphasizing this area and investing these resources, me, and we as a news organization become a respected leader in this area that ultimately can and will and has proven to increase readership, viewership, and listenership. Is that a word? People who listen to your medium. I hope that answers your question. All right, we got about 10 more minutes. I can continue to look at questions. Nobody wants to show their face and their lovely voices. Let's see.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi. Sorry, I could not see the hand, like raising the hand icon, so I just jumped in for the question. So I'm actually not a journalist and joining from Peru, and I've been working in the development sector, which involves working with the government, local organizations, and specifically targeting all these social development issues covering like health and climate change and like all these issues. So I mean, definitely there's my personal interest in this training. I actually completed the solution journalism in Spanish a couple of months ago. And this is my second time to participate in this. So when you mentioned just right now all this impact that you can bring out from this solution-focused the stories on climate change, since I'm not a journalist, I would like to a bit know more about how this solution-focused articles or storytelling are perceived in newsrooms or actual from the media. So my experience is that just as a reader, I have been reading certain articles focused on more or less, for instance, climate solutions on the Washington Post. So I was wondering how these specific solution-focused articles are perceived, or are there real needs to focus on these stories, how these can be, and then, and secondly, as a follow-up question, what skills would be most important to develop this kind of storytelling? Definitely, it's a multi-skilled, I think, avenue, and the journalists would all different aspect of skills to develop the solution-focused articles. But I would like to know if you can prioritize a few skills that could be more important for solution focused stories than others.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that question. And I appreciate the detail of your question in the background. And Alex, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. I will go to you next. So as far as a particular area of expertise in regards to solutions journalism, I think you have to have an analytical mind and curious mind, right? But I think that all journalists should be curious, right? And all journalists should be analytical, meaning like we want to see the sum of the parts. in the stories that we're telling, and also in the information that we're looking to gather. I think the 4 pillars of solutions journalism helps in achieving both goals, because it is a blueprint for how to organize your thoughts, and also the research that you're doing, the questions that you're doing in your interview. If you identify, you first identify, and in these 2 weeks, I don't know if it's this week or the next, I share a diagram that really helps you dissect a potential journalism story. And again, a solutions journalism story. And again, not all stories are solutions journalism, but you want to first, you identify what the problem is. And once you identify what the social problem is, then you start to say, well, what has been the response to this problem? Not the proposal, not the idea to solve it, but the actual response. Because then you can, as I've mentioned before, you can measure the effectiveness and ineffectiveness of that response by applying the other pillars, what the evidence is, the insights, and the limitations. So I think why, so being curious about what the responses is, and analyzing the 4 pillars to the response to the social problem are key to the success of that story being a solutions journalism story. And I think the effectiveness in regards to a solutions journalism story versus one that's just focused on the problem is what it provides the audience. And that again is not just be informed, but to be educated and empowered. We want people to be inspired to do something about it, whether it's as individuals or in enacting pressure on those in power that have the resources and the influence to affect change. Alix, I think I pronounced your name correctly. I think you're gonna have the last question.
Yes, you have. Thank you. And thanks for everything that you shared. It was really, really interesting and useful. I was thinking about the framework that you've shared, and as well about the idea of sharing the news that are empowering. And for me, what really stands out is the language that is used when it comes to climate change. So not only I find it highly, highly technical, statistical and all that, which I think loses many, many people. But what strikes me, and what I was wondering what's your view on it, is around the relationship that we have with climate change, and that I see coming through in a lot of stories, which is very much almost of a power and of a fighting. Like, are we going to fight? We're in a fight with our own climate, our own planet. And it feels very much like a winning or losing game. And I think when it comes to how do we empower people to take actions towards it through the stories, I think this wording is actually super important. Because in my view, one of the key reasons we are in that situation is because we have become so disconnected from our nature and our own planet that we are then, commodifying it and using it and exploiting it and all that. And I think that the fighting and the tension that we put around it is not helping actually solving the issue and changing the mindset of let's reconnect with nature, let's reconnect with us. And I think as well that, just changing some small words, like from fighting to addressing climate change, or, small things like that would also make a big difference, maybe more on an unconscious level, to how people can also feel that they can relate and they can have an impact on that problem. So I was wondering what your views were on that.
Well, I agree with you 100%. And I appreciate you sharing those insights. I think we live and work with words, and we know words have a large impact and influence in shaping people's minds. And so to your point, I think it's really important to be very purposeful and mindful of the types of words that we use. Sometimes, I've seen people that they're brilliant, and they're using a language that, right, goes over people's heads. I don't know what it means, and you've lost me, right? And depending on the medium, our job is to be able to reach people. And if we're not reaching them where they live, and that's figuratively and physically, by using the word and framing, then we're not doing our jobs. We're just writing a story for ourselves to, pat ourselves on the back and make us feel good, or our fellow colleagues feel good. I think a couple of things came to mind as you were sharing your thoughts. Too often, when with climate coverage, it's almost like an apocalyptic story. Oh my God, our planet is doomed, right? The next generation is the last generation because the planet destroyed, and people turn away from it automatically. They don't want to read it because there's no hope. I also mentioned previously, we have to humanize the stories, right? It can't just be about statistics. You integrate the statistics, but show me how this affects me by profiling someone that's like me or someone that I recognize, right? Not literally, but oh yeah, I know a person like that. I think that also helps people understand better the bigger picture, because now we're applying it to our daily lives. There's a story that we're going to publish next week about monarch butterflies. Monarch butterflies in the North America migrate from Mexico into the United States. And in Chicago, because of climate change, we've seen a decrease of the population coming to Chicago. And we're profiling a story of a woman in one of Chicago's neighborhoods that decided to plant milkweeds because that's the only place where monarch butterflies lay their eggs. And when they migrate, that's what they do. Anyway, is she changing climate, the climate situation that's created the number of monarch butterflies population and the number that come to Chicago? Probably not. But it shows how one person, inspired by culture, she happens to be Mexican, is making a change, and that, like dominoes, has an effect for other people, to have larger conversations individually and with people of power and influence, because ultimately there needs to be three different governments: Canadian government, American government, Mexican government, working together and changing policy in order to change that population or bring back the numbers. So I think personalizing it, being mindful of words, using solutions journalism to not, again, put lipstick on a pig because the problem is a problem, but really what's being done to solve it is really important. And it provides people something that they can digest, as opposed to really feeling like this is out of my control. There's nothing I could do about it except just, curl up and just wait for the worst to happen. And then lastly, I would say, as storytellers, it really depends on the medium. We're too often we're a guide, right? We are telling this story of other people, but a lot of times you just got to get out of the way. Let them tell the story. Let's provide a structure, but let that person's lived experience drive the story, where we're just stepping back. Think what we haven't learned yet from social media is the direct conversations that happen between people that are either living in the same city or across the planet. If we just step back and let them have those conversations, there's a lot that we can learn and a lot that they learn from each other. I think that's has been one of the most effective storytelling that I've seen in social media that has had an impact, whether it's on climate coverage or other. We have run out of time. I really appreciate your insights, Alix. And thank you everybody for spending your hour with me. I really am enjoying reading all of the comments in the forums, and I will continue to engage as best as I can with all of you. But like I said, this is hopefully the beginning of more conversations that we have with one another and you with each other. I think one of the things that I love the most about these courses are the relationships that are being built at the forums between journalists that have, in this case, we're all interested in climate coverage, solutions journalism, but that come from many different walks of life. I will see you in the forums, and I'll talk to you next week. Thank you.